Welcome back. This is week 15, lecture 2, Trade, Exploration, and Slavery. Now, this lecture is, for the most part, for any real sense, the last substantive lecture of the course. Next week, week 16, we have a lecture on kind of wrapping up and focusing on justice and the overview of justice, which, of course, is the theme of your term paper. And then getting ready for the final, the lecture which is a review to help get ready for the final. But this lecture looks at the broader perspective. Way back when, even when I was as an undergraduate, I had a course in Europe, Africa, and Asia. These courses used to be called European Expansion. That was seen as being too Eurocentric. But there are reasons to refer to it as European expansion. I'll be talking about the emergence of what Emanuel Wallerstein referred to as the world system. If you see up there on the PowerPoint slide, that's point 4, where really Europe is reaching out to the world. And it's a long process, and I'll be talking about some of the stages along the way. But it is a time when Europe is establishing colonialism and establishing colonies and really set the stage for the world politics until the end of World War I. And in still some ways, even still today, we're still dealing with the let's say, the end of colonialism and the impact that has made. So that is where this course kind of ends in terms of the whole development. And it was kind of based on this concept of confessionalization, which I talked about in the last lecture. And when I ended that with arguing that early modern Europe was anything but an increase in toleration and individual freedoms and liberties and rights. Because confessionalization was based on individual views of, we know the truth. We're right, you're not. And that was, let's say, the solution that Europeans came up with as they were dealing with the problem of Christendom no longer working and the emergence of a new myth, the myth of the nation state, which I think I mentioned. I think I did. If I didn't, I should have. In the last lecture, and I'll be talking more about this lecture and then the next lecture as well. And it's not based on an opening up and a freedom of individual rights. It is based on simply coming to terms with the fact that this single concept, this overriding program, operating program, as I think I've referred it to, the myth of Christendom, no longer pertained because they had differing understandings of what that truth was. And that led to then truth being based on the concept of the nation state, which then still is a myth. And it was based then on this idea of God is on our side and we are right, and this is still the issue of eternal salvation being at stake. And they're wrong. They said that religion was in no ways an individual personal choice. It was a matter of state. And that is where we really see emerging the power and centrality of the state as the basic operating program for what, as I've referred to these things, basic ideologies or so, whatever, but the structures that allow us to make sense of the world in which we find ourselves. Now, that kind of all being said, this lecture, I'm going to hit on some of those developments. The written lecture for this week, I think, is really important. It also has some excerpts of sources, a letter from Columbus, so to speak, and then also one account of Magellan, the Aztecs. So those are important selections, and this written lecture is an important lecture also for your exam, because you can refer to those and see what I'm talking about. There's also some more maps in the written lecture that I include here. But the point of this is to kind of come to this culmination, which is really a turning point and sets the stage for new development will be talked about in H114. So that's, or at least in my H114, that's kind of setting the stage, so to speak. So let's get down to it and look at Christendom and the world, which is the first point here, and to see that Christendom, which has so often been treated as just simply an internal unity as it was, and for so long that was the focus, when all of a sudden it begins to look outward. Now, this is going back quite a ways to show some of these development, because the whole shift of Christendom from looking just internally to looking out, so to speak, at the broader world really begins with the Crusades in the 11th century and part of the medieval Renaissance, as I discussed. Because there, all of a sudden, it's like we are part of something larger. Now, we've known about Islam, we've certainly known about Judaism because we have Jews living here. But this concept of we need to help our Christian brothers, even though we've already split from them in the Great Schism of 1054. And that will give us the upper hand in terms of superiority. You can say, oh, wasn't this all self-serving? Yes. But these distinctions, as I said I've made before, between what is good for me, what can I get out of it, and what is then this ideal between can I make a lot of money on this, and is this the right thing to do for God? These ideals that often we see as contradictory at the time are all one and the same, and they don't see any contradiction. They don't see a contradiction in terms of going to fight the infidel, and perhaps it being a huge benefit for at least the Pope in terms of the political tensions between the Eastern Greek Church and the Latin Western Church. And for individuals going on crusade, hey, we're doing this as a holy war, but also we're going to get really rich. And that was part of the motivating factor. So that led to this really beginning sense of there's a whole new world out here. And that then led further to, and we can continue to make money if it's not by conquest, by trade. Now I have up here medieval trade again, because I've already dealt with medieval trade, but I just want to look at a bit more and remind you of that earlier lecture with medieval trade. Because that too, after the Crusades, sets the stage. And this map up here of 11th and 12th century trade routes, I'm not sure if I included that in the earlier lecture dealing with medieval trade or not. This looks quite extensive, but what this shows is all the trade routes, not just those of the Europeans, meaning that there were trade going on in the East and in Africa, but the Europeans weren't participating in those, and they begin to hook into those trade routes to bring back more goods to Europe, and Europe develops a taste. I mean, Marco Polo reached China for the first time, first European to reach China in 1260 or so. And so these 11th and 12th century trade routes were still, this is, again, globally everything. And it wasn't until the 17th century that Europeans reached India. And so in terms of this map up here, it can give a false impression if this is looked at as, oh, this is where Europeans from medieval Christendom were trading in the 11th and 12th century. That network, we'll see, was expanding. But in the 11th and 12th centuries, it was for European trade, pretty limited. And that was what I think I already referred to the Hansa in the previous lecture. This next map that I have up there shows a map of the Hansa trade. There was also trade at this time, that means in the 11th, 12th, on into the 13th century, from Genoa and from Venice, the ports there in Italy, who were making some of the connections with and trading networks from the East. The thing is, we don't see Eastern trade coming all the way to Europe. We do end up seeing Europe going all the way out to the rest of the world. That is the distinction. This was all based then too on exploration, and the trade led to these ideas of we can find new things. And I have up here then exploration and discoveries, exploration and discoveries. That was a slip of the tongue, but very fitting. So often we think of it as with Columbus. Now, I hope you all know Columbus did not prove that the world was round. He knew that it was round. That was the basis of his whole journey in theory that he could get to the east, i.e., India, and the spy, or what he called India, and some of the spices that came from the east, if he went and sailed west. Now, Prince Henry the Navigator was the first European to really expand beyond Europe, and I talk more about this in the written lecture. That was already in 1412 when he started sailing down the coast of Africa. Obviously, Africa was known, so it's more of just venturing out, even though it is pretty fearful if you don't know where you're going to, and your sailing skills are not that great. But Prince Henry went down the African coast, far beyond where the boundaries of the old Roman Empire had been. And it even establishes a trading post. So all of a sudden, we have European presence. It's not yet a colony, but we have European presence in a non-European territory. But Columbus then really opened things up because, as you know the story, he sails west to get to the east for spices and the new profit that can be made. He does so for the King and Queen of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, which actually was had not really just recently become kind of Spain because they united Aragon and Castile, the two crowns, together under one unified rule based on their marriage. And they were willing to give him a shot. Columbus was Italian. He was a Genoese, and they were already involved in trade. So he knew what was going on in terms of trade, and he was studying the maps, and he figured that he could make a lot of profit if he could get to the east, bring back these exotic spices and things that Europe was really developing a taste for based on the overland trade, if he could sail west. Instead of, they couldn't even sail to the east because they had not gone around the Horn of Africa yet, the Cape of Good Hope. So there was no way to sail to the east. It was all overland, sailing through the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, here and there, but it was a long, arduous trip. A lot of places were not interested. Now, in the late 15th century, we know that the empire was not going to fund it. Italy, there's no such thing as Italy, but the individual city-states, generally, they didn't really have the finances to fund it. Portugal was interested, and Prince Henry, the Navigator, was from Portugal. But Columbus then finally got backing and financing from the King and Queen of Spain. And he also said, this will be for God. And the letter that is included in the written lecture talks about gold and glory and God. Those three G's, hard to get out. And he discovers this whole new world, which he then refers to as India. It took him his third voyage till he really said, I guess this really isn't India. I just said it earlier, Europeans didn't get to India until the 17th century. But there was some trading with Columbus in terms of they had not established colonies there. Columbus didn't establish colonies there, and we really have a very vague understanding of what was really the India that Columbus was referring to, if that makes any sense. Anyway, leaving that aside, this discovery of Columbus was also one that he considered to be, this land has vast resources of gold. We can make a fortune. And Spain started to reap the wealth and the benefits of the New World, with the gold bullion being brought back. And that led Portugal to really get going. And Portugal, as I said, with Prince Henry the Navigator, was really the first nation, or the first state, to have, let's say, state-backed exploration. And there almost gets to be a competition for the markets. And they ended up having to go to the Pope in 1494, and they divided the world between Spain and Portugal. Here's a map of that Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. And you can see that there. The yellow is Spain, is what the Spain would have, and the purple is what Portugal would have. Portugal could go to Africa, which Henry the Navigator had done. And then kind of to the far east, and what we consider now the kind of the further east and the west, it would be then America and the American continents. So that is how it was divided. And just to think that the Pope, who considered himself to be in charge of the entire world, so okay, I am dividing up the world between Spain and Portugal. Go for it. That's what, in some ways, is the most important thing about the Treaty of Tordesillas. Let's say the hubris of the West, of Europe, to claim that they can divide the world between themselves. Also, you'll see that part of what is now Brazil was part of Portugal's region. And that makes a lot of sense because Portugal is the language now of Brazil, whereas most of the rest of South America speaks Spanish. There's Portuguese in Brazil. So that is kind of what was going on. And it was really not understood the opportunities from a European perspective that were involved with exploration, discoveries, and then beginnings of colonialization. Because once you find that these are lucrative places for trade, you establish trade outposts. And from trade outposts becomes colonies. That's what we saw, or already said Prince Henry the Navigator was the first to establish that trade outpost at Ceuta. That becomes then colonialization, European colonies. And what happens there? You have Europeans then going to the colonies to settle, to make as European as possible, and to dominate those people there. And it's based on this colonialization, based on exploration and discoveries, that really led to Western civilization being brought into a world historical context, the history of the world as such. That's what we're talking about, the expansion of Europe. This is what really is I'm talking about. And it's not so much that it's Eurocentric, except that's the starting point, because the Europeans were often seen as backwards and as invaders. But when we look at it from the perspective of the West, which is still a concept that we deal with today, a myth that we deal with today, we see it as Europeans increasingly exerting their power and influence and exerting their exploitation around the world. That's what we're talking about. Now, to understand some of this, I have up here the Exploration Empires map, just kind of shows the extent to which, by the 1600s, we have colonies across the globe, European colonies across the globe. We have Spanish, Portuguese, French, Dutch, and British were the ones that really were the primary ones. And it's state-sponsored colonies. It's not just there for colonies of merchants. It's state-sponsored colonies. And what do we make of all this? And what was the driving motor for it? And that brings us then to the slide, Profit and Piety. Now, I talked about Calvinism in the previous lectures and his understanding of predestination. I believe I mentioned, if I didn't, I should have, but I think I usually do, and I didn't go back and look, my apologies, that Calvin's understanding of predestination was always one looking back, and it was basically formed within the threat of persecution, that God is in charge, and everything is predestined. And that's not a determinism. But what happened with Calvin's understanding of predestination was that it became precisely the inverse or the opposite of what Calvin intended. And it became based on this idea of God will not grace people who are not predestined. It would make sense, because if people are going to hell, if God has deemed that Bob is going to hell, God is not going to make it possible in terms of that predestined side of things for Bob to become wealthy and happy and have a great life. So the whole issue with predestination was not Calvin's understanding of it, but this perversion of Calvin's understanding of it, which turned actually predestination into a doctrine of works righteousness. And I have the Protestant work ethic, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. That's really formulated by this 19th century German sociologist Max Weber, as you see his name there in the slide. This idea of we have to work as hard as we can, because the more successful we are, the more evidence we have of our own predestination. It becomes a sign of predestination. Now, I had, when I talked about the ecclesiastical ordinances of Calvin and the signs of the church, was proper preaching of the gospel, the correct administration of the sacraments, and then discipline. That discipline combined then with the perversion of Calvin's understanding of predestination. So that is like with disciplined hard work, we can be successful, and God would not predestine the damned to be successful. So only those who are successful are part of the elect, part of the saved, part of the predestined. And so we work hard to get it, because the more successful we are, we're part of the predestined. And if we're part of the predestined, we're going to heaven. And if we step on people's toes to get there, that just means we're part of the predestined, and they're not. They're going to hell, so it doesn't really matter. That was this mentality. Now, Weber, in terms of religion and the rise of capitalism, to see how closely they combined, formulated, I forget exactly when it was, the spirit of capitalism, the spirit of Protestantism, the rise of capitalism, or something like that. I always forget exactly what the title of his famous book was. I mean, his big book, it was Economy and Society, but he incorporated his kind of Protestant work ethic and the Protestant spirit of capitalism in there. And I'm not going to go into all of his arguments, basically, but very differently from Lutheranism. Calvinism was what he called this worldly ascetic, whereas Lutheranism was more focused on the otherworldly ascetic. Calvinism was really focused on asceticism, discipline in this world, and that the capitalist economy that was emerging, when it did emerge in early modern Europe, especially with the Industrial Revolution, cannot really be understood intellectually without understanding this fusion of, let's say, a perverse Calvinism, or what I'm calling a perverse Calvinism. Weber didn't. I'm calling it that. But this combination of Calvinism and capitalism. Now, that relationship between profit and mission had already been there. I may have mentioned this before too. It's kind of an irony of development with Saint Francis of Assisi in the 13th century, the founder of the Franciscans, based on the whole order was based on this concept of poverty. And Francis was known as the Poverello, the poor little man who, naked and poor, was to follow the naked and poor Christ. By the end of the 13th century, Francis had become the patron saint of merchants. I mean, he came from a merchant family. That just shows how these different motives at the time were not seen as contradictory at all, but as harmonious and complementary, in fact. That we can go out and seek profit for God, basically. Now, Tawney, who was a little bit younger than Weber, and a good English socialist, wrote a book in opposition to Weber's thesis called Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. That's where that title comes from, because that was the title of Tawney's book. And I quote one of the major passages of his conclusions in the written lecture. But Tawney argued that it was a complete bastardization and perversion of Christianity to use it to defend exploitation and profit. And he said the ideas of capitalism, I'm paraphrasing the quotation that is in the written lecture, that the ideals of capitalism are antithetical to the teachings of Jesus. You can say what you want, but they are antithetical. Capitalism and Christianity. Christianity defined as the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. That was Tawney's point. Not a point that has been listened to very much. And another critique of Weber could be that's not just the Calvinists, the Protestants. It's not just the Protestants. Catholics did this too. When you read about Magellan and Montezuma and the whole Spanish colonies on the west coast of what is now the United States, but also in South America, that was based on pillage, plundering, and everything else. Like California missions. Yes, it was based on mission and desire to save these poor souls. I'm not discounting that at all. That was real. Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. That was a divine command. It's just that if we can also make money at it, all the better. That was what was going on. And if we can then establish ourselves as those who are superior, because we know the truth. We know the divinely revealed truth. It is our duty to teach these unfortunate people who've never even heard of it before. And if they won't be taught, what do we do then? It's a very parental. This is also the origins of what later became known as, pretty early on actually, the white man's burden. It's incumbent upon us, we white men from Europe, to save the world, to educate the world, to civilize the world. That is our burden. Because it is very difficult, and also not everyone goes along with it, which makes it increasingly difficult. That was the idea, too, then, behind the new slave trade as it was developing. Now, this is the emergence of the world system that I talked about, from profit and piety. In the introduction to this lecture, I mentioned Emanuel Wallerstein. He was, I should know if he was British or American. I forget, actually. Or German. Maybe he was German. Gosh darn it, my apologies. That's kind of embarrassing. But what he argues is that in the course of the 16th into the 17th and 18th century, what emerges is a world economic system consisting of the core and periphery. The core is Europe. The periphery are those countries and territories that Europeans were trading with. The purpose of the periphery is to enrich the core, or the mother country. That was the whole purpose of colonies. And he constructed this whole concept of understanding world history as a world system. And this is where we really see the globalization taking hold. Because you can't understand the trade and the establishment of colonies and the process of colonialization without also understanding the religious factor, the political factor, the sense that the Europeans had this idea of we want to get there first, not just as Europeans, but as Spain, as Portugal, as the Dutch, when they finally realized what was going on, as the British. We really see the origins of the British Empire here. This idea that we have to impose ourselves on the world for the betterment of the world and for our own enrichment. That was what was going on with this world system, as well as in seeing it as core, we're the core, and we just exploit every other place, a periphery, based on their relationship to us. That is the system that Wallerstein kind of established or revealed or pointed to, whereby the entire globe was connected, this connectivity. And also that included the new slave trade. Now, the slavery has been around since there have been humans. Rarely has slavery been the foundation of entire economic system. It was in ancient Rome, slave societies. They've talked about really slave societies in Rome, slave societies then in the American South, and in Brazil, and with the New World in terms of the sugar plantations, and so where the basis of the whole economy is based on slavery. And it wasn't in Rome originally, but it became to be that. So this is not to say that there was no slavery before, but this is a point where Europeans start trading slaves as commodities. Now, this is not a pretty picture. But they would trade slaves, send them to the New World for work, bring back. It was called the triangular trade. And if you look at this next map up here, this kind of shows the triangular trade that was part of this world system as Europeans were establishing their colonies across the globe. Slavery was a commodity. It was never that the Europeans went down the coast, west coast of Africa, and then kidnapped Africans and whisked them off on slave ships. Africans were selling the Europeans their own slaves that they had conquered in wars. Different tribes. Slavery was always part of war. If you win a war, you enslave the people, usually, or at least some of them, as part of the war booty and bounty, and part of the spoils of war was more slaves. And so, but the Europeans certainly went along with it, especially when there became an increasing market for slavery in the New World, with the sugar plantations, and eventually with the cotton plantations in the American South. Cheap labor is an important factor, still is. We don't legally allow slavery, but with the level of the minimum wage, with the level of the lack of benefits so often offered to workers, just because there's a paltry payment of a salary or earnings or wages that are given, does that mean therefore it's not slavery? It's not trying to exploit individual workers for the benefit of those who are in charge. That's something to consider. Where the same phenomenon is there, the exploitation and using of human beings for one's own benefit. So why should we be so shocked that slavery was great, or seen as great, or big, huge? It was problematic. First time I taught Western Civ was at the University of Tennessee, way back when. My first position here in the United States. And I wish I had written this down. If ever you come across something that you want to remember and save, write down the reference, because I've lost the reference. Within the University of Tennessee Library, this is on teaching 114, and the slave trade in the 17th century, I came across a book of translated Dutch letters from the Dutch the Dutch West Africa Company, which were part of the slave trade. The Dutch East India Company was part of the spice trade, but the Dutch West India Company was based on the slave trade. And these are good Dutch colonists. This one letter was from one of the sailors to the captain of the ship, and said, "You know what? We really have a problem, because if these Africans are fully human, if they're fully human, what we're doing is absolutely wrong and sinful, because they are, creatures of God just like we are. Now, if they're not fully human, if they're more animal, that's no problem. Now, he's not being aware of animal rights, certainly. And the fact that he even poses the question of whether these Africans are human or fully human is telling as well. But the point is, he realized if they are human, this is wrong. And that sentiment that this is wrong, the horrible treatment of the slaves, in the written lecture I give some statistics in terms of the new slave trade going on into the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. It's horrific in terms of what human beings can do to other human beings. But I would argue the horrificness of what human beings do to other human beings is still going on, that we allow it. The suffering, the pain. As long as we don't have to deal with it. That attitude, the attitude behind slavery has not changed, even if slavery as an institution has been outlawed. That's my point here. Now, with colonialism, with the world system, with the Atlantic trade, the triangular trade with slavery involved, we have colonialism, we have European domination, and we have Europe seeking to exert itself throughout the world. Just as an example, here's this map up here, the main Eurasian trade route, 1650, and this is for a time after the period of this course, but not that far after. If you compare this to that earlier map of trade routes in the 11th and 12th century, where I distinguished it and said that most of those networks, the Europeans only went so far. Now, Europeans covered the whole world with colonies. That is the point I want to make, that all was an outgrowth of this switch from the myth of Christendom to the myth of the nation state, because competition between the states fueled the desire for establishing colonies, gaining new wealth for the state, for the attempt to establish the power and authority of a given state throughout the globe, all in the name of God and state and religion. I think I mentioned all the way back with Rome, what made for a pious Roman: devotion to God, to the gods, to the state, and to family. So it's like religion, politics. What makes for a good Dutch Calvinist or an English Calvinist or whatever? The same thing. Devotion to God, their understanding, the theological understanding, and to the state, all in the name of profit. That altered, as I said, altered the world from the later 16th century until after World War II. And it still is affecting us. And when we look at this, it's like, where is the justice in all of this? When human beings look at other human beings, not as human beings really that are equal, but as the other, does it mean to be equal? Is the concept of justice something for simply individuals, or is it for, as I have up there on the slide, the collective? Meaning the state, the group. And the problem with justice is, what is it? What's it based on? How is it defined and determined? That was Plato's problem. It still is a problem. What is justice? Does it mean to be just? For a government to be just, for an individual to be just. That's why I assigned Plato's Republic and had you do, or hopefully most of you have already done it, your term paper on Plato's Republic and the concept of justice. That's why I've tried to make the concept of justice the kind of the thread throughout this course. I'll be talking more about that in the next couple of lectures. wrapping things up because it's part of your final exam. But is it something that, if things are more just now, for me, is it necessary that then things become less just for you or for others? This us, we, them, us, we, them, that's not very good. Us, we, them, or the division, which obviously I'll go all the way back to the Greeks, and this whole concept of the West itself is based on that. We are good. You are not. We are just. Doesn't matter what we do to you. This is setting the stage for the development of modern Europe as we see early modern Europe emerging in the course of the 16th century with all these developments, transforming the myth of Christendom and becoming the myth of the nation state, which in so many ways was a cruel state. And that wasn't just a singular state. And that applies to Catholic states, and to Protestant states of all types. Once this competition for wealth and colonies took off, it's only perhaps those countries, those states that didn't really participate, that we could talk about a different type of justice within the boundaries of those states. Maybe not. Was Prussia a just state? Was the Kingdom of Bavaria a just state? Probably not. But they weren't doing some of the absolute exploitation and barbaric suppression of other human beings that the other major trading companies and colonial powers were. So is justice then relative, or is it an absolute? Is cruelty relative or an absolute? If I'm less cruel than you are, does that make me better than you? How do we get rid of it? How do we establish justice that can be agreed upon for everyone? That's not simply based on what is just to me. And then what is that concept based on? It has to be a universal, a philosophical understanding or a theological understanding of justice. Otherwise, it's simply political power. That justice is that the government, whoever is ruling or whatever form of government it takes, can impose on its citizens as being just. Those are the options. And that is what I have wanted you to grapple with, this term, because we've seen it from the very beginning. And I'll be going over again kind of the overview next lecture. But that is kind of where this course ends, with the emergence of early modern Europe. So often it's seen as a positive development, modernity. We're getting there. We may not be there yet, but we're getting there. Thank God we've gotten out of the horrible dark ages that were the Middle Ages, and the barbarity thereof. That is about as completely false of a statement or thought as there possibly could be. The increasing lack of toleration emerging out of the Reformation, out of the emerging of early modern Europe, when we know that I am right, when I know that God's on my side, and what that allows me to do to others who do not agree with me. That's the issue. Early modern Europe was not an age of individual rights and freedoms and beginnings of openings of humanity. It was an age of increased cruelty, lack of toleration, restrictions, as it was moving to what has been called the age of absolutism. But those are terms and concepts and developments for next course, H114. So that's it for this course in terms of this subject matter. I'll be back with the two final lectures, or the final lecture, which is just a wrapping up lecture, and then the preparing for the final. So if you have any questions, as always, just send me an email. Thank you for your patience, and I will see you again shortly. All right, bye-bye.